G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Joshua. This has been a study that has been taken from a commentary prepared by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, the founder of RL Ministries Worldwide. Thank you for coming along. We're into session 5. We're going to go from chapter 7, verse 1 down to chapter 8, verse 29. That's the hope. Now, just a quick recap on the last session. Well, last session we saw the conquest of Jericho. We had 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of Jehovah. They march around Jericho once a day for 6 days, blowing their shofars. Soldiers, priests, the ark of the covenant, and the people all march around once a day for 6 days. They couldn't make any other noise. They had to be silent. But then again, on the 7th day, something quite different happened. On the 7th day, the Israelites marched around the city after the same manner as on the preceding 6 days, but on the 7th day, they circled the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priest blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for Jehovah has given you this city." And when they did do that, the whole city, which remember was under the Kerem curse, it was devoted for destruction, except for Rahab and her family, and all the family who remained in her household. And we see that the city was going to be destroyed. Now, all the silver, gold, and vessels of brass and iron, they were all devoted to Jehovah for the treasury of Jehovah. Not treachery, treasury. Now, when the people heard the trumpet blast, they all shouted, and the walls of Jericho fell flat except for Rahab's house. And all the Israelites destroyed the city. Rahab then became part of the Commonwealth of Israel, and in fact, she became one of the ancestors of the Messiah. A curse was placed in Jericho that anyone who rebuilt Jericho will lose the first son when he lays the foundation of the wall, the second son when he finishes the city by putting up the gates. Now, this was fulfilled centuries later during King Ahab's time. Result of all of this happening with the destruction of Jericho was that Joshua's fame spread right throughout the land. Now we're moving into this session. We're going to see the sin now of Achan. This is chapter 7, verses 1 to 26. 7 verse 1, we see the sin. The verse now begins by spelling out the collective responsibility. It says, "But the children of Israel committed a trespass in the devoted thing." A Hebrew word for trespass here is the word mal, M-A-A-L. And the root of it means to act undercover, and it has the derived meaning to act treacherously or to act secretly, and it indicates a breach of trust. Now, as in, you can look at Leviticus 5:15, it shows you something very similar there. Leviticus 5:15. Now, generally, this breach of trust is against God by prolonging or withholding what was sanctified or devoted to him. Now, we see here, although only one man sinned, what happened was the responsibility is actually corporate. And so it was Israel, the entire nation, that trespassed. So all Israel had committed a trespass. And why this sin was called a folly in Israel in verse 15. This is what was called a folly. Now, from the collective responsibility, the verse goes on to tell us about the individual responsibility. And it begins with a person. For Achan, it now goes on to give us the line of Achan. He was the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah. Achan's lineage is traced only back to Zerah, who was a son of Judah's immorality. Check it out in Genesis 38:15 to 30. Now, in 1 Chronicles 2:7, his name is spelled Achar, A-C-H-A-R, which changes the meaning to troubler. And his sin is he took of the devoted thing. So remember, everything was under the Kerem curse. Everything was devoted to destruction except for the gold, silver, those sorts of things, which was going to the treasury of Jehovah. Now, Achan, he took some of that stuff. And the result is, and the anger of Jehovah was kindled against the children of Israel. Verse 2 tells us about the sending of these spies now. Verses 2 to 5 tells us about the defeat of Ai. Now, we send the spies out, and Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, or Ai, which is beside Beth Aven, on the east of Beth El. So Ai is located west of Jericho and high in the hill country of Ephraim. The text puts the town near a place called Beth Aven and Beth El. Now, then we have the command. God spoke unto them, saying, "Go up and spy out the land." This is, Joshua. Go up and spy out the land. Remember earlier on he sent out spies to spy out Jericho. Same thing, doing here again. And in verse 3 we have the report of the spies. First of all, the return. And they returned to Joshua and said unto him. So they make a suggestion to him now. Let not all the people go up, but let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and smite Ai. And the reason for that was, make not all the people to toil thither. Now, what does that mean? It means not to worry don't worry the people. This is a big job. Don't worry the people. Just send 2,000 or 3,000. Very practical suggestion in a manner of speaking. Why? Because Jericho was actually 900 feet below sea level, and Ai is about 2,600 feet above sea level. So this would make it a climb of around about 3,500 feet, or around about 1,000 meters, through desert territory at a very hot time of the year. So at their suggestion, just don't send all of us, just send some of us. And they say, for they are but few. What they're saying is, well, there are but a few people in Ai. Now, this time they got it wrong by saying that the Ai army was small, when according to chapter 8:25, they actually had 12,000 fighting men. So they thought they could defeat Ai with only 3,000 men. Now, later on, God will tell them to bring the whole army in chapter 8, verse 1. The irony is this here. Back at Kadesh Barnea, they thought the enemy was too strong and overestimated their strength. While here, they underestimate their strength. So previously at Kadesh Barnea, they overestimated the strength of the enemy. But here they are at Jericho, and they underestimate the strength of the people of Ai. In verses 4 to 5, we have the account of the defeat, because they get defeated. And the attack is, so there went up thither of the people about 3,000 men. And then comes a failure, and they fled before the men of Ai. And then in verse 5, we see the casualties. And the men of Ai smote of them about 36 men. So what we see here is that because of one man's sin, right, 36 people now die because of that one man's sin. And following the slaughter is the pursuit. And they chase them. So the men of Ai chase them before the gate, even onto Shebarim. Now, this is the only mention of this place, and the site is unknown to this day. And it says that they smote them at the descent. And this was a sharp descent from up high, going back down to the Jordan Valley. And the result is, it says, the hearts of the people melted and became as water. Now, this was the same terminology that was used twice before about the Canaanites back in chapter 2:11 and chapter 5:1. But now it's used of Israel. Israel's hearts have melted and they became as water because they're running away from the men of Ai. And verse 6 now gives us the physical response of Joshua, which were signs of mourning. And Joshua rent his clothes, he tore his clothes, and he fell to the earth upon his face before the ark of Jehovah until the evening, he and the elders of Israel, and they put dust upon their heads. Now the tearing of clothes, the falling face down before God, and the putting of dust upon the head were all signs of mourning. And then we see in verses 7 to 9, we have the verbal response. And Joshua said, Alas, O Lord Jehovah, wherefore have you at all brought this people over the Jordan to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites, to cause us to perish? Would that we had been content and dwelt beyond the Jordan. So that's his complaint. Now in verse 8, he tells about the defeat. First of all, the perplexity. O Lord, what shall I say? After that Israel hath turned their backs before their enemies. And then we see in verse 9, Joshua mentions the possible response of the Canaanites. First of all, the hearing. For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of this, hear about us running away from Ai, and will compass around and cut off our name from the earth. And what will you do for thy great name? And that is a key phrase to understand Joshua's true concern here. When they have destroyed our name, this is what Joshua believes, that, when they hear about how we fled, they're going to come and destroy us. So when they've destroyed our name after you have chosen us to be your people, and you've brought us here with signs and wonders, what's going to become of your name? What's going to become of your glory if we get destroyed? Because our name is of no consequence. But will you destroy the honor of your name if you destroy us? That's basically what Joshua is saying to God. Now, remember, God had promised Israel this land. And so he's saying, what people would be there in that land to honor your name if we should be destroyed, God? Who's going to honor your name in the land? Certainly not the Canaanites. Now, 3 observations here. First of all, while initially Joshua's complaint may have sounded like the murmuring of the people in the wilderness, this showed that his primary concern here was with the honor of God. He's worried about God's name. Second, we see at Kadesh Barnea, back in Numbers 13 and 14, they were guilty of willful disobedience back then. But here, they are bewildered because they are sure that they were doing the will of God, because the land was given to us. We're going to take it over. And third, we see the grief of the people is not only over the loss of the 36 men, but also that their first attempt to conquer a Canaanite city in the country promised to Israel has now been met with failure, and they turned the tail and ran. We see the response of God now in verses 10 to 15. And Jehovah said unto Joshua, here it opens up in verse 10 with a command and a rebuke. Get you up. Wherefore are you thus fallen upon your face? The point of the divine question is that Joshua needs to look for the cause of the calamity, not in God, but in the sins of his own people. And so in verse 11, he spells out the cause. Israel has sinned. Yes, they have even transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them. Yes, they have even taken of the devoted thing, and have also stolen and dissembled also, and they have even put it among their own stuff. So God now went from the general, yes, Israel has sinned, yes, now he goes right down to the specific. As to the general, he stated that Israel violated his covenant. Keeping it was viewed as a covenantal obligation. Now, as to the specific, God pointed out that they had stolen devoted things and hidden them in their own possessions. The observation to make here is this. While only one man was guilty of these things, God used a plural pronoun, they. Since Israel is a covenantal community, there is a principle of collective responsibility. And in verse 12, we have the result for Israel. First of all, therefore the children of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies because they are become accursed. In other words, Israel has now become a kerem, C-H-E-R-E-M, a kerem curse. Remember kerem, the word kerem? The problem is not that the Canaanites are stronger, but that Israel has become weaker. It's a reversal of chapter 6, verse 26. Israel is now fallen under the kerem curse, and the curse must be removed before Israel can become a victorious nation again. That's the first result. The second result is, I'll not be with you anymore, except you destroy the devoted thing from among you. The problem here was not that of willful disobedience, but ignorance of a hidden transgression. And so, God's warning was not that of destroying the nation, but to show the problem why the nation was not victorious. And in verse 13, we have the obligation. It begins with a call to sanctification. Up, God says, sanctify the people and say, sanctify yourselves against tomorrow. And the reason is, for thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, there is a devoted thing in the midst of thee, O Israel. Thou canst not stand before thine enemies until you take away the devoted thing from among you. So God called his people Israel to sanctify themselves, explaining again that they would not be victorious unless the devoted things which they stole from the city was among them. This is from Jericho. And verse 14, we're told about the procedure. In the morning, therefore, you shall be brought near by your tribes, and it shall be that the tribe which Jehovah taketh shall come near by families, and the family which Jehovah shall take shall come near by households, and the household which Jehovah shall take shall come near man by man. So the search for the culprit was to begin in the morning of the next day. The process of elimination was to contain 4 steps. First of all, it goes from the tribes from Judah to the clans or families, from the families to the household, and from the household to the individuals, and from the individuals to one person in particular. And they're going to find him. There are some observations here. First of all, God does not tell the people directly who was guilty for the sin. He'll do so only by a process of elimination. Second, as mentioned, the process of elimination was to consist of 4 stages. First of all, we have a narrowing the selection down from the tribes to the clans or families, from the clans to the households, and finally from the households to the individuals. Third observation, this elimination emphasized the involvement of the whole nation in this sin. Also, it focused the attention on the guilty individual. And the fourth thing we see here is that this is consistent with rabbinic tradition. The selection was made with the use of the Urim and the Thummim. Urim and Thummim, meaning the 12 stones. Remember the 12 stones that were attached to the breastplate of the high priest. The words Urim and Thummim mean lights and perfections. And these stones responded to yes and no questions. If the answer was yes, they lit up. If the answer was no, they didn't light up. They just remained unlit. Now, another observation here is to point out what the rabbis teach about this process, and that is that when the stone of the tribe containing the guilty party dimmed, that tribe, Judah, was then further scrutinized by lots to determine the guilty family, household, and individual. So the rabbis have something to say about this as well. In verse 15, he declares what their punishment must be. And it shall be that he that is taken with the devoted thing shall be burnt with fire, he and all that he has. Now, verse 25 adds that he is to be both stoned and burned with fire. And the rabbis say that he was stoned because he sinned on the day when Jericho was taken, which happened to be a Sabbath. And he was burned because he violated the Kerem curse. That's why both things happened to him. Now, the actual reason, that's the rabbinic, that's rabbi saying it. Now, the actual reason is twofold. First, because he has transgressed the covenant of Jehovah, and second, because he has wrought folly in Israel. Now, Hebrew word for folly is Nebala, N-E-B-A-L-A-H on your screen, and it's used in several ways in Scripture. Most common way it appears to be used is in the area of immorality. And that's the way it's used in Genesis 34:7, Deuteronomy 22:21, Judges 19:23 and 20, verse 6, along with 2 Samuel 13:12. They're on the screen there. Second way it is used is of something foolish or a selfish attitude, as in 1 Samuel 25:25. Third way it's used is of godless speech in Isaiah 32:6. But by and large, Nebala is a technical term for a flagrant sin. A flagrant sin. Now, the identification of this culprit, this transgressor, we see in 16 to 21. It encompasses verses 16 to 18, beginning in verse 16, with Joshua initiating the process of elimination. So Joshua rose up early in the morning, and he brought Israel near by their rulers, by their tribes, and the tribe of Judah was now taken. So this is the first stage. Lights would have lit up. First stage of the elimination process pertained to the tribes, and the light fell on Judah. Then came the second stage in the first part of verse 17, the clans, right? And the act, and he brought near the family of Judah. the clan of Judah, and he took the family of the Zerahites. Out of the tribe of Judah, the light fell on the clan of the Zerahites. Then in second part of verse 17, we have the third stage, which is the families. And the act, he says, and he brought near the family of the Zerahites man by man, and Zabdi was taken. Now, in 1 Chronicles 2:6, his name is given as Zimri. Zabdi was known as Zimri in 1 Chronicles 2:6. And then in verse 18, we have the fourth stage, which is the households. We have the act, he brought near his household from man by man, and Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, the tribe of Judah, was taken. So in this last stage now, the light lit up. It fell on one member of the household of Zabdi, a man called Achan. Two observations. First of all, God could have identified Achan by name, but by using this very slow process, he was making a necessary impression upon Israel concerning the seriousness of their sin. Second, we have an example of a principle found in Proverbs 16:13, which states that the lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of Jehovah. So, what we're seeing here in this instance, instead of casting lots, they're using the lighting of the Urim and the Thummim. And that was what was used here. But the principle of Proverbs 16:33 still applies, and that is, it's the Lord who determines the outcome. The Lord who either chooses the lot, causes the lot to fall, or it's the Lord who causes the light to light up. Then in verse 19, we have the admonition of Joshua. And Joshua said unto Achan, My son, give, I pray you, glory to Jehovah, the God of Israel. Now, when he says to give glory to Jehovah, this was a sacred formula of adoration by which a person was called upon to confess before the face of God what the truth is, as we also see in the New Testament, John 9, verse 24. And going on, so it's John 9:24, and then he goes on and he says, make confession unto him, unto Jehovah, tell me now what thou hast done, hide it not from me. Now, the Talmud derives from this verse, right? The Talmud derives from this verse that all people sentenced to death should be encouraged to confess their sins so that they would have a guaranteed place in the age to come. And so, this is what the Talmud says, right? Not the biblical scriptures. And so by confessing his sin before execution, he does have a guaranteed place in the age to come. Again, that's what the Talmud says. Now, in verses 20 to 21, we have Achan's confession, beginning in verse 20, the general acknowledgement of sin. And Achan answered Joshua and said, of a truth, I have sinned against Jehovah, the God of Israel, and thus have I done. Okay. In verse 21 now, we have the specifics of the sin are laid out. And as he confesses his sin, he points out that there are three stages to it. First stage was, when I saw among the spoil a goodly Babylonish mantle. Hebrew for Babylonish is the word Shinar, and this is where idolatry began with the Tower of Babel in the town of Shinar in Genesis 11 verses 1 to 9. Genesis 11, 1 to 9. You find Shinar there where idolatry began. And then Achan goes on to say, and he says, and he saw 200 shekels of silver and a wedge of gold of 50 shekels weight. So he had seen silver and gold and this beautiful robe from Babylonia in the plunder. And the second stage was, then I coveted them. Third stage came and took them. And now the location is, and behold, they are hid in the earth in the midst of my tent, and the silver under it. Two observations here. First of all, the progression was that he saw something, he coveted it, he took it, and second, the rabbis declared that because of Achan's confession, he'll have a place in the age to come. That's what the rabbis say. Now we see the execution of Achan in verses 22 to 26. In verses 22 to 23, we have the discovery and the retrieval of the devoted things. Begins with the agent in verse 22. So Joshua sent messengers, and they ran onto the tent, and behold, it was hid in his tent, and the silver under it. Then came the delivery, verse 23. And they took them from the midst of the tent, and brought them unto Joshua, and unto all the children of Israel, and they laid them down before Jehovah. Now, since these items were kerem, which were devoted, they belonged to God, and that's why they were laid before Jehovah. And in verse 24, we have the place of execution. It begins again before the collective obligation. And Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan the son of Zerah, and the silver, and the mantle, and the wedge of gold, and his sons, and his daughter, and his oxen, and his asses, and his sheep, and his tent, and all that he had. Now, observation to note here is corporate guilt requires corporate removal of the guilt. The list of Achan's property includes not only material items, but people and animals as well. The family must have known of the crime, since the booty or the plunder was buried in the family tent. So the family must have known about it. And what we note here is that the kerem judgment upon Achan included his sons and daughters, since the ban was upon him and all that pertains to him. So his name was truly blotted out of Israel, and he has no family line. In the place of execution, it says they brought them up onto the valley of Achor. Now, this type of corporate punishment does not violate what is taught in Deuteronomy 24:16. Deuteronomy 24:16. Deuteronomy 24:16 states, "The fathers shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin." Now that's what Mosaic law in Deuteronomy 24:16 says. The Deuteronomy passage is dealing with human punishment, and punishment that is by humans and not divine punishment. Achan had failed under the kerem curse by laying his hands upon that which was devoted, and therefore he and his entire family were to be punished, similar to a town that had fallen into idolatry, as you can check out in Deuteronomy 13:15 to 17. So Achan and his whole family fell underneath this kerem curse. Something similar is seen in Deuteronomy 13:15 to 17, where a whole town had fallen into idolatry. And then, in verse 25, we're given the statement of the execution. The declaration is, "And Joshua said, Why have you troubled us? Jehovah shall trouble you this day." And now the rabbis interpret the phrase "this day" as an indication of assurance taken that he's having trouble this day only, but he'll not have it in the age to come. He will have a share in the age to come. Again, that's what the rabbis teach. So from this day onward, Achan, they say, will not be troubled, but will experience the pleasures of paradise with the righteous. And like Achan, all who were condemned by the Sanhedrin were instructed to confess their crime before their execution, and thus were assured of a share in the age to come. Then came the execution itself. The executioners were, and all Israel stoned him with stones, and they burned him with fire and stoned them with stones. Now, in English, this word stone sounds the same, but in Hebrew, two different words are used here. First word is the root ragam, R-A-G-A-M, ragam. It's used as the act of stoning as the form of capital punishment. The second word is sakal, S-A-Q-A-L, which has to do with the casting up of stones upon the bodies after they've been burned for the purpose of erecting a memorial pile. So first stone is stoning in capital punishment. Second stone is heaping stones upon them, burying them as a memorial. And in verse 26, we have the name, or we have the memorial and the name. First of all, the memorial, and the act is, "And they raised over him a great heap of stones unto this day." Now, That's a very common way of burying bad or cursed people, is heaping upon them stones. We see this, we're going to see this again in Joshua 8:28 to 29, and later on in 2 Samuel 18, verse 17. And the phrase here, "unto this day," means it was still visible when the book was written. Then came the name, wherefore the name of that place was called the Valley of Achor, which means the Valley of Trouble. And again, you see it was here, "unto this day." There are two other references to this event, by the way. It's mentioned again in Isaiah 65:10, Isaiah 65:10, and Hosea 2, verse 15. Now, the Hosea passage prophesies that in the future, the Valley of Achor will become a door of hope instead of a day of trouble, a place of trouble. Okay, the Valley of Trouble. Now, moving on, we're going to see the conquest of Ai. With Achan's sin now punished and the danger for the entire nation now removed, God now guided Joshua to attack Ai a second time. This time he would go before his people and Ai would fall. Conquest of the city we find in verses 1 to 29 of chapter 8. See the promise of God in verses 1 and 2. Promise of God begins, "And Jehovah said unto Joshua," so he initially states two words of comfort, "Fear not, neither be you dismayed." So we have some comfort here. Then comes a command, "Take all the people of war with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai and his people and his city and his land." So this time Joshua was to take the whole army with him, not just 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers as before. God promised that he would deliver Ai into his hands. And then verse 2 contains a point of similarity and also a point of dissimilarity with the attack on Jericho, which we saw back in chapter 6, verses 2 to 5, 6, 2 to 5, and verse 19 and 21, 19 and 21. Now, what's the point of similarity? Well, the point of similarity is this: "And you shall do to Ai and her king as you didst unto Jericho and her king." That's the point of similarity. The point of dissimilarity is, "Only the spoil thereof and the cattle thereof shall you take for a prey unto yourselves, set you an ambush for the city behind it." So, as of now, they can start gaining or gathering spoils of war. They couldn't take the spoils of Jericho, but from here on in, they can keep the spoils for themselves. God also gives them the means by which the city is to be taken. Joshua and his army were to set an ambush behind the city. God would then give them victory. But it was to be accomplished not by a supernatural act, but by a ruse using or a trick using military strategy. This shows that God will not always use the supernatural. He did so in Jericho, he'll not in Ai or in the subsequent conquests. The specific instructions from God required the deception of the enemy. And that should be noted here. God's instructions to Joshua included the deception of the enemy, just as Rahab deceived the people of Jericho because this was war. A few observations about the tactics spelled out in verses 1 and 9 and the way things went in the following verses. First of all, Joshua is going to select 30,000 men, going to send them by night on a 13-mile journey and to lie in wait on the west side of the city. This is going to come out in verses 3 and 4. These soldiers were to be the attack force prepared to enter the city from that side. Second, the next day, Joshua took the main army of Israel up to the north side of the city, and this we're going to see in verse 11. And these troops were to be a diversionary force to draw the army out of the city, leaving the city exposed to an attack from the west. You're going to see that in verses 13 to 17. Third, another 5,000 was sent to lie in ambush between Bethel and Ai. And this we're going to see in verse 12. They were deployed as a defensive measure to prevent the army from Bethel from joining forces with Ai and outflanking the 30,000 on the west side of the city. Now, the rabbinic perspective in this pretty much follows this outline here. First of all, Joshua dispatched an ambush. Main army positioned itself before Ai. Joshua dispatches 5,000 troops to create a second flank. Army of Ai attacks Israel. 5th, Joshua pretends to flee and retreat. 6th, seeing as they're retreating, all of Ai's troops rush outside the city, join the initial thrust of Ai's army. Meanwhile, army of Bethel also joins the chase. The two cities are now joining the chase. 7th, the ambush party raids defenseless. The ambush party raids defenseless Ai and sets the city on fire. 8, Joshua sees Ai burning, reverses his fields, his troops, and defeats the army of Ai. And 9th, Israel then returns to Ai, kills all the population. So the rabbinic view is very close to what the biblical view is here. That was just a bit of trivia for you. Now, instructions were 38. These are the instructions to the 30,000 on the west side of Ai. In verse 3, we have the selection. It begins with the act of obedience. Now, Joshua arose and all the people of war to go up to Ai, and Joshua chose out 30,000 men, the mighty men of valor, and sent them forth by night. And this was for the purpose of beginning the process of the ambush. And in verses 4 to 8, detail Joshua's specific instructions to this contingent of 30,000, beginning in verse 4, with the purpose of the selection. And he commanded them, saying, Behold, you shall lie in ambush against the city, behind the city. Go not very far from the city, but be ye all ready. The ambush was to position itself west of Ai, this is the 30,000, as close as possible to the city. Verses 5 to 6, Joshua now spells out his own role and points at the 3 steps. First of all, in verse 5, and I and the people that are with me will approach unto the city. That's the first thing. Second thing, and it shall come to pass when they come out against us as at the first, that we will flee from before them. And the third step in verse 6, and they'll come out after us till we have drawn them away from the city, for they will say, they flee before us as at the first, so we'll flee before them. So twice Joshua used the phrase, as at the first, showing that he assumed the army of Ai would respond as it did on the previous occasion. And then we see in verses 7 and 8, he spells out what, Then in 7 and 8, he spells out what their role should be. And they're to do 2 things. First of all, in verse 7, they are to capture the city. And the act is, and you shall rise up from the ambush and take possession of the city. And the promise is, for Jehovah your God will deliver it into your hands. So the men in hiding, the 30,000, were to rise up from their ambush, take hold of the city, for God is going to give Ai into their hands. And then the second thing they must do in verse 8 is to burn the city. The timing is, and it shall be when you have seized upon the city, that you shall set the city on fire. And the basis is, according to the word of Jehovah shall you do it. See, I have commanded you. So, once they've taken the city of Ai, they're to burn it in obedience to God's command, and it should be recognized that the instructions coming from Joshua are the instructions of God himself. All right, so now you see the plan of ambush. See the plan of ambush here in verses 9 to 13. In verse 9, we're told about the 2 forces. First of all, the 30,000. Joshua sent them forth, and they went to the ambushment and abode between Bethel and Ai on the west side of Ai. Second, we have Joshua. But Joshua lodged that night among the people. Now, having been sent away with Joshua's instructions, the first force, 30,000 soldiers, posted itself at the place of ambush west of Ai. Second force consisted of Joshua and his soldiers, who spent that night with the Israelites. This second contingent was the main army, further described in verses 10 to 13. In verse 10 to 11, we have Joshua's approach to Ai. And the timing is, and Joshua arose up early in the morning. And then he explains the actions taken. First of all, he says he mustered the people. And then second, he went up, he and the elders of Israel. And the location is before the people of Ai. And then we're given some details here concerning the action. And all the people, even the men of war that were with him, went up and drew nigh and came before the city. And then we have a small geographical fact here. Now there was a valley between Bethel and Ai. And Joshua positioned the main army north of Ai on the opposite side of a valley that lay between them and the city. And then in verse 12, we deal with the 5,000. So we have the 30,000, then we have the 5,000, and we have Joshua's army as well. And he took about 5,000 men, and he set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai on the west side of the city. So this 5,000 force is also in hiding in that valley. It's the valley we spoke about earlier on. And so the verse here reveals the reason for the geographical fact which we looked at before. So this contingent was now in hiding in the valley mentioned in verse 11. And then in verse 13, we read about the 3 divisions. So they set the people. The first division was even all the host that was on the north of the city. And the second division and their allies in white that were on the west of the city. So on the west of the city, then comes a third division, and Joshua went that night into the midst of the valley. So now all 3 divisions are now ready to launch the attack. This is the ruse, the ambush, and the taking of the city of Ai. In verses 14 to 17, we see the response of Ai. Verse 14 gives us the attack by the army of Ai. And it came to pass, when the king of Ai saw it, that they hastened and rose up early. And then we see the attack. And the men of the city went out against Israel to battle. And then we see here, he and all his people. And again, the timing, the appointed time. In this case, meaning as Joshua planned it. The geography is before the Arabah. That's where they are. This is part of the Jordan River Valley. And then the fact, but he knew not that there was an ambush against him behind the city. Because he's facing the Arabah, which means he's facing east. Where's the army hiding? Hidden armies on the west side of the city. He sees the 5,000 Israelite army on the east side toward the Arabah, but he does not see the main army behind it. And in verse 15, we have the ruse. And Joshua and all Israel made as if they were beaten before them and fled by way of the wilderness. So in verses 16 to 17, we have the pursuit of Israel. Verse 16 describes the pursuit. And all the people that were in the city were called together to pursue after them. And they pursued after Joshua. And the result we see in 16b to 17. And were drawn away from the city, and there was not a man left in Ai or Bethel that went not out after Israel. And they left the city open and pursued after Israel. Again, this shows now that the army of Bethel came to help the army of Ai. As a result, Israel are going to end up taking 2 towns rather than just 1. They came for Ai, they're going to get Bethel as well. Now we see the defeat of Ai in verses 18 to 29. Verses 18 to 23 describe the victory in the field, and verse 24 to 28 details the events surrounding the taking of the city itself. And then 29, we see the execution of the king of Ai. Okay. 8 to 13 is the victory in the field. In verse 18, we have the sign of the javelin. Okay. Spear, javelin. Begins with a divine command here. And Jehovah said unto Joshua, stretch out the javelin that is in your hand, for I'll give it into your hand. Now the javelin held out toward Ai was to be a sign that God would give the Israelites victory. And then came the obedience, and Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand toward the city. In verse 19, we see the taking of the city is now spelled out in 4 specific steps. First step, and the ambush arose quickly out of their place, and they ran as soon as he had stretched out his hand and entered into the city and took it. And they hasted and set the city on fire. So the first step here was that the men who had been hiding west of Ai quickly rose from their position. And in the second step, they rushed forward as soon as they saw Joshua's outstretched arm with the javelin. And the third step now pertains to the entrance into the city and the capture of the city. And the fourth and final step, they quickly set it on fire. Then, my chair's sitting forward. Then verse 20 goes on to tell us the effect this had on the army of Ai. The timing is, and when the men of Ai looked behind them, they saw, and behold, the smoke of the city ascended up to heaven. And that led to the following result. First is the fact, and they had no power to flee this way or that, meaning They could no longer attack Israel, nor could they return to their own city. And then came the reason for this. The people that fled to the wilderness turned back upon the pursuers. So now the ones who were being pursued now turn around and now start to pursue the pursuers. So the Israeli forces that had been pretended to be defeated and in flight now turn to battle their pursuers. Verse 21 and 22, we have the slaughter of the army of Ai, beginning in verse 21 with the fight between the warring parties outside the city. And when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city, and the smoke of the city ascended, then they turned again and slew the men of Ai. And then we're told about the reinforcements. And others came forth out of the city against them. So we have the faction of the army that had captured the city now comes out into the field of battle. So they were in the midst of Israel, some on this side, some on that side, and they smote them. And the result was so that they let none of them remain or escape. They killed everyone. And then in verse 23, we have the capture of the king of Ai. The king of Ai they took alive and brought him to Joshua. Now, we see the slaughter of the city in verses 24 to 28. So after now killing all of Ai's soldiers, the Israelites re-entered the city and killed its inhabitants. The account is described in 24 to 28, with verse 24 providing a reference to the timing of this event. And it came to pass, when Israel had made an end of slaying all the inhabitants of Ai in the field, in the wilderness wherein they pursued, and they were all fallen by the edge of the sword, until they were consumed, that all Israel returned unto Ai and smote it with the edge of the sword. Now what we see is once the fighting of the men of Ai and their allies had been killed, that's the men of Bethel as well, the Israelites turned against the people who were hiding in the city. And verse 25 then provides us with some details here. And all that fell that day, both of men and women, were 12,000, even all the men of Ai. The entire population of the city consisted of 12,000 citizens, and they were all killed on that day. Then in verse 26, we have the symbolic meaning of the javelin. Remember, Joshua is holding the javelin out for as long as this fight's going on. For Joshua drew not back his hand, wherewith he stretched at the javelin, until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. Now, this battle, think about it, is reminiscent of Moses' raising his hand during the campaign against Amalek, the Amalekites. Exodus 17:11. But here with Joshua, it had to do with holding his hand stretched out with the javelin in his hand. So Moses had raised his hands and he had help to hold his hands up while the battle was going on. But here, Joshua is holding the javelin, holding it out towards Ai until the battle is over. And in verse 27, there's a statement of exception here. The act is, only the cattle and the spoil of that day, of that city, Israel took for prey unto themselves. What did they do so? Well, because according unto the word of Jehovah, which he had commanded Joshua. Remember, I was not under the Kerim curse to the same degree as was Jericho. Here only the human beings were under the Kerim curse, but not the animals or livestock. And in verse 28, we have the account of the destruction of Ai. So Joshua burnt Ai and made it a heap forever, even desolation unto this day. Now, unlike Jericho, Ai was not rebuilt again in the lifetime of the author. It remained a ruin throughout the period of the judges and kings. However, it was rebuilt when the Jewish people returned from Babylon, and you can see that in Ezra, the little book of Ezra, Ezra chapter 2, verse 28. Here we see what the word forever in Hebrew. Again, it does not mean eternity as it does in English. It only speaks of the end of a period of time. In this case, the period of time is the author's life. And then we go on to the execution of the king in verse 29. And the king of Ai he hanged on a tree until the eventide, then the burial and the timing. And at the going down of the sun, after the execution, the corpse was left hanging until sunset. Then it was removed from the tree in obedience to the Mosaic law. Check that out in Deuteronomy 21, 22 to 23. Then Joshua commanded, and they too his body down from the tree. And they took his body down from the tree and cast it at the entrance of the gate of the city and raised thereon a great heap of stones. And then we have the statement. It says, "Unto this day," meaning it was still true when the book was written. Two observations here. First of all, the defeat of Ai now moves Israel from the edge of the promised land in the Jordan Valley to the center of the country and into the hill country, which is now much more strategic. Second, the taking of both Ai and Bethel meant that the hill country of Ephraim was now in Israelite hands, which allows for the next event to occur, but we're not going to see that until another 2 weeks' time. So, come to the end of this session. Study hard, grow strong.